Hello and welcome to webinar number 1 as part of the KonMari Kids program. I'm going to jump right in because there's quite a bit to cover as part of webinar 1, and I like to keep these to about the 45-minute max 60-minute mark. So as always, I will begin each and every webinar with a little welcome note of housekeeping points to kind of pass along to you. The first of which, and this is especially important given this is the first presentation, if you are watching live, this really only pertains to viewing this live. If by times you experience audio glitching, it very, very seldom happens, but if it does, I first will receive a little indication that there's a problem with the audio, and I'll always kind of relay that during the presentation and try and remedy anything on my end that requires it. But if you are noticing on your end either glitching or sometimes you'll just lose audio altogether, the best thing to do is to actually exit out of the program, shut down the webinar, and then rejoin. And 9 times out of 10, that corrects the problem. Now, I'm not expecting that there's going to be audio glitches, but I do like to kind of pass that point along just because sometimes they do happen and it can be a little confusing at first if you're not sure what's going on. So that's the first little point that I want to pass along. And the second is to sort of familiarize you all with the question panel and how that works. So what tends to happen, or in fact what exclusively happens, is that when a comment, question, or note comes in, you won't see that as an attendee. Again, if you're watching this live, you won't get a little notification, but I will. So what I will do is right in that moment, I will stop because I get like a little signal. I'll stop, I'll read it. I never disclose names. It's really not relevant. So if you want to share something that's personal or you just really don't want your name touched, do know that I won't mention your name as part of me relaying the question or comment to everybody else, but I will do that, and then I'll answer it right in the moment because, 50% of the time, at least, if you're thinking something, somebody else watching live or for the playback will be as well. So it's always nice to kind of say that in the moment for me to kind of clarify or answer those questions as they come up. The other thing is just to note that you can type in the question right in the panel. I have like a screenshot up there. I think the program has actually updated since I inserted this little clip, but if it doesn't look exactly like this, it will look very similar to it. So do just kind of familiarize yourself with what that looks like, and do take advantage. I really do encourage you to take this opportunity as one to really have your questions answered. It's so, so important. I can't stress this enough that you feel really comfortable in your typing. So if there's anything that you're just not sure of, please ask. The next thing that I want to more or less remind you of is the fact that the webinar is being recorded, and especially for those of you who are attending the live presentation, I really do encourage you to just take this opportunity as one to kind of come back to center, if you will. Really take this time as a great opportunity to connect with your individual journey, with your vision. And everything that I'm sharing as part of these webinars, I am sharing in a really casual way. I don't feel that there's really a need to take notes per se. It's more about me just sort of covering off the things that I have shared already in the PDF and the video and certainly in the Facebook group, and maybe adding a couple of little tips here and there. But really on the whole, this is more a way for me to facilitate you coming back to center, you reconnecting with your journey. So do take this time as one to just void as many surrounding distractions as possible and just use this time as your own for this journey. And last but not least, I will let you know that toward the end of the webinar, I will just kind of open it up for general question and answer. So if there's anything toward the end that you didn't really feel was necessarily relevant to the information that I was sharing within the presentation, do feel comfortable to, of course, share that in the question and answer period. All right, so this is what I will be covering as part of webinar number 1. First and foremost, I want to do just a general recap of last week's first tidying category, of course, going through clothing. And then I will speak a little bit about this week's current tidying task, and that is going over books, going through books. And then I really want to talk about how to facilitate going through the KonMari method as a family. And there's really 2 different approaches to this, and I really want to break it down and explain that so it's very crystal clear. And hopefully for those of you who are still undecided on how you want to sort of journey through this first portion of the process, it will be a lot more clear to you after I've gone over this information. And then I want to share a bit of guidance in terms of how to tidy during busy weeks. And of course, this group in particular knows the definition of busy, especially within the dynamic of a family. So I want to speak a little bit about that specifically. And then of course, I will conclude with the Q&A. So let's talk about clothing. First and foremost, I always pass this along because I do appreciate in the video, and of course the videos are always embedded in your weekly emails. I shared the way in which I fold clothes, which does, I will acknowledge, differ from the way that Marie Kondo instructs. I know there's a visual aid, at least in Spark Joy, on how to fold clothes, but I will reassure you all that I did share my version, my sort of tweak on Marie Kondo's style of folding with Marie Kondo during my training seminar, and she was fine with it. Really, and this is something that I'll talk about throughout, honestly, the entire program, but this is really about establishing something that is sustainable for you for the long haul. And there's nothing wrong with making tweaks or making adjustments so that it is something that comes more natural or feels more comfortable to you. So there's always the option to do things a little bit differently if it speaks more to you. So in the video that I shared, I did show a visual demonstration of me folding in my style, and I came to that style after trying Marie Kondo's version and really just it not working for me, because in my experience, and I've also had clients share the same, when you fold in her style, you really do require the use of a solid flat surface. And for me, I'm folding for 5 people. I need it to be very practical and efficient. And sometimes I don't want, quite frankly, to take the opportunity to sit down and fold really nicely. It is a very gratifying experience, I will acknowledge this, to give yourself some time in folding so that you can really have that moment of joy with your clothing. And I know it seems a little silly maybe for some, but there is definitely something that comes with the act of folding. However, in my day-to-day running of my household, I simply don't have time for that. So the style that I showed, in which I just take basically one side of a shirt to meet the other, I just kind of fold it right in half down the front, fold in the sleeves, and then fold up in thirds or fourths. I can do that while standing up. I don't need a flat surface for that. But if you're somebody who has the time or really just has the desire to actually practice the art of properly folding, I did want to share with you this visual aid in which you can see here, starting in the top left-hand corner, the recommendation is to fold one side of the shirt at a time in toward the middle, and then from there fold up in thirds or fourths. So what I encourage you to do is to actually experiment with both to see what sits best with you. I have not found that my style compromises the structure or even really the appearance of shirts in drawers. It really just comes down to a personal preference. So do play around with both. Give yourself some time to kind of settle into what works best for you, because again, this will become a practice in which it will be automatic in time for you. You won't really have to think about it, but you need to settle into this new routine. So that I did want to pass along to you. And then I also wanted to talk about the reality of when clothing does not spark joy. And this happens. I've had a lot of conversations over the last couple of years of now doing consulting work in which a lot of clients struggle with sort of the bridge that I always describe between how you used to function within your wardrobe and the direction that you're moving in going forward. And it's not an immediate switch. I think the impression is that it is supposed to be that way or it should be that way. And if it's not, there can be a feeling of not being successful. So I just kind of want to talk about that a little bit. So, first off, um, sometimes the reality is that you are left with limited options, and this can be unsettling. A lot of people, especially I find North Americans, tend to have larger wardrobes. For some reason, we feel comfort in that, and maybe it's because we have this false impression that we have a lot of options, when in reality, and if you've tidied your clothing, you can probably relate to this, you actually don't when you have a mass amount, but maybe three-quarters of it aren't options, whether you just don't like the style or whether the clothing doesn't fit you anymore, or maybe it needs to be mended and you haven't done that yet. If you can think back to the way that you were prior to tidying, and this was certainly always my experience, I had my go-to favorites. I had my favorite sweaters, my favorite pants, the jeans that I always wore, but yet I would have, say, for every 10 pair of pants I owned, maybe only one pair that I actually chose to wear. But for some reason, it's nice to think that we have a variety, but that's always sort of a falsity, because the reality is if it's not an option in terms of fitting into it or actually liking the style, then it really isn't an option. So when you're left with limited options, an easy way, hopefully, to be able to remedy any feelings of unsettledness is to recall the fact that even though you may have had an abundance of clothing before, you still only had certain clothing, certain options that you actually wore. And so all you've really done is just group them together, and then for the rest of your wardrobe, the wardrobe that you didn't wear, you're just removing it. You're removing that visual distraction. And for most clients that I share that with, there's kind of like an aha moment, a little settling there. So I like to always pass along that idea. The other reality, it certainly was my reality, is that I couldn't financially right away go out and replace everything that I decided to get rid of. And so, what I always recommend doing if you find yourself in a similar situation is to start prioritizing. I always encourage making a master list of the things that you would like to purchase, the things that require replacing in your wardrobe. So, you might have something like black dress pants, a black cardigan, maybe a white blazer. I'm just kind of giving you examples here, but usually people have a few things that they have identified that they need, that are kind of staples to their wardrobe. But this is where, you have to kind of go with the process. You have to trust the process in that this isn't an overnight thing. So you can identify the items to which you want to replace, but you also have to recognize that moving forward, you don't want to make impulse decisions, even if financial concerns aren't something that you have to consider. You do have to consider the reality of not necessarily being able to go out and find perfect spark joy replacements. So there definitely is a period of transition. And to kind of come back to my recommendations, write a list. The list will prove very, very valuable to you prior to going shopping. This is something that I implemented actually when I went through the KonMari method, is prior to just arbitrarily going out to shop, I would always, and still do, refer to my shopping list so that it's fresh in my mind what I actually need. So I'm not distracted, I'm not making impulse decisions, and I don't get home thinking, oh shoot, I meant to look for that black cardigan, because I've reminded myself before going out. And even when I'm shopping, I still refer to the list just to kind of keep me in check with what I'm ultimately looking for. So do recognize, what's top priority for you, and take time. I always say it's worth saving up for something that sparks joy than just buying a temporary placeholder over and over again. If you're feeling indifferent toward an article of clothing, and this happens, it certainly happened for me, I always encourage leaving it in your closet for a time, but make sure that when you are storing it, you're storing it in such a way that it's always visually in front of you. You're always having that reminder of that item of clothing. So over time, and only give yourself like put a timeline on this. Give yourself a max of maybe 2 weeks. I think that's a fair amount of time to see whether or not you reach for that item, you make use of that item, and it will become very obvious to you within a short amount of time whether or not that item actually sparks joy or not. And it will also allow you time to process maybe what you're feeling toward it. Are you feeling nostalgic? Are you feeling practical? Are you trying to be conservative financially, so you're trying to convince yourself that something sparks joy when maybe it doesn't? So take time to kind of work through those feelings, especially this early in the process, because you're still really working toward establishing your spark joy meter, right? That doesn't necessarily come right away. It's a work in progress. So in moving forward with your clothing, be content. As I sort of mentioned, this is a period of change. You are sort of walking over that bridge toward how you used to manage your wardrobe, how you used to have a relationship toward your wardrobe, and how you want things to be moving forward. But as I said, that's not necessarily a corner that everybody turns without having to look back. It is a work in progress. This is um, a very big learning experience, and it is one that takes time. So do be patient with yourself. Analyze your clothing, in particular your organization and your storage, over the next few weeks. This is one of those really unique categories, and there's only about two of them really within the entirety of the process in which you have to put things back. And so if you're putting things back into a certain home, like obviously within your bedroom, you're probably limited to either closet for storage or dressers or a combination of the both, obviously. So your clothing has to return to these said spots, but take time to really analyze how it's working for you. So maybe you got creative after tidying your clothing and you put things back here, there, and wherever, but see if further adjustments are required. Give yourself time. I know I probably changed things up maybe 3 or 4 times before I really settled into an organization and sort of a storage routine that really worked. Storing off-season clothing. This is a question that I receive a lot on what to do. It really, again, comes down to personal preference. It certainly comes down to storage availability. Not everybody has the room within the closet and or dresser to be able to store the entirety of their wardrobe. For me personally, I like to have my wardrobe stored, all of it, in my closet and dresser. I need to clarify that. And that's simply because I often wear sweaters in the summer and also wear t-shirts in the winter. So I like to have access to my entire wardrobe. Not everybody does. The only thing that I will sort of encourage you to do is prior to packing away a season's worth of clothing or returning that season of clothing to your wardrobe, take that as an opportunity to do a quick retidy. The way that you felt about an article of clothing when you stored it and the way that you may feel 6 months later bringing it back out of storage may be very different. So instead of just putting things back up, hanging them up, or folding them and putting them away, take this as an opportunity to really do a quick retidy. Anticipate shopping differently. I kind of touched on this a little bit, but um, I often I often have clients say to me, I had no idea how much this would alter my shopping and spending habits. And it really is a big change, a big eye opener as well. For me, I used to shop really as a hobby. I enjoyed it. I would buy things on impulse. I never really thought too much about what I was buying. And I'm a very frugal person by nature. So if I found something on sale, as long as the price was right, I didn't really consider any other factors. I do apologize if you can hear the phone in the background. I'm just going to leave it. Um, I didn't really think about those things. I just went by way of whether or not the price was right and if it spoke to me in the moment. And that really, over time, put me in the position of feeling very overwhelmed by my stuff. And now I hardly feel the call to go shop. If I do, I'm shopping for a certain purpose. And I expect all of you to feel the same to some degree. And for some people, it can be really sort of off putting, especially if you were by nature a big shopper. So I always kind of like to pass it along as a bit of a heads up so that you can expect, again, to some degree, to feel a little bit different toward that. All right, with children. Okay, so we're going to talk specifically about sort of the family aspect of this. If you decide that the timing is right, if it really speaks to you, and there is, let me be very clear in saying this, there is no obligation at this time to tidy with your children if you don't feel that it's speaking to you to do that. You can always, always, always hold off until, a little bit later in the program or even the very end of the process, whatever suits you best. But if you do decide that you want to go ahead and you want to tidy with your children, facilitate, not dictate. And this is the same approach that I encourage you to take while also tidying with, whether it's your partner or it's somebody else. You really, and this will benefit you in the long run, you really want that person, whether it's a child or an adult, to have the experience of determining what sparks joy for them individually, right? And if you dictate, if you share your input, if you tell them what to do, if you try and sway their opinion on whether or not to keep something or let it go, ultimately what you are doing is you are not allowing them the experience of figuring out what sparks joy for them. You're limiting their ability to be able to establish that. And it's so crucial to get this right, especially with clothing. And truly, children as young as 3, they know what they like and what they don't. I have a 3-year-old, and every day she lets me know what she wants to wear. She's very clear in her selection. And I know not all children have as big of an opinion as my daughter does, but children do. They know what they like. We as adults, we know what we like. And that is what it means to spark joy. And so you really want to develop that with your children. This will serve you so, so well in the future. So afford anybody that you are helping to facilitate tidying with, afford them the opportunity to experience this for themselves, void of your input. For smaller children, like I'm talking probably anywhere between the age of like 3 and 8. And I mean, this is always dependent on your individual children. I always say keep it light. Smaller sessions tend to work better because they're able to focus more. You really, really want to keep your child engaged, excited, motivated. Ultimately, you want the experience to be positive and upbeat because this will allow them to feel excited by this and to want to do it again. If they leave the experience feeling, oh my gosh, that was awful, I disappointed my mom, I didn't get to pick what I wanted, it was really boring, they're not going to want to do it again, right? So you really want to set yourself up for success with this. And so if you keep it light and short and snappy and fun, then they'll be on board to do it again. So really, really do think about this. And I always encourage sort of planning out your session prior to jumping in with your child. So before you just say, okay, well, it's after school, it's a rainy afternoon, they're not going to be going out to play anyway, we might as well toddy. Think about other factors as well. Is your child in a good mood? Do you think that it's a good time in terms of, maybe there's not exterior distractions going on? You really want to cater to your child in particular. The same is true to obviously tidying with adults as well, but in particular with children, you really want to have the optimal set of things in place before you kind of jump right in, because again, especially right out of the gate, you want it to be a really positive, successful experience. All right, so let's talk about the current tidying category of books. And we really haven't talked a lot about this, certainly not in the group. And I do that intentionally because I always like to give it a few days at least, since I share the information for people to kind of settle into it. I feel like if I get really hyper and I'm sharing a lot of stuff about books, it can be really overwhelming. And so I just like you all to have the opportunity to kind of come to the category and experience it a bit before I start sharing my input. So it's been about 3 days now since I sent out that email, and I think it's a really good time to kind of talk about books because there's almost two different camps of people when it comes to books. Either you are all about your books and it's a really challenging, really demanding category, or you're sort of passive about books and they really hold just a temporary amount of meaning to you, and it's an easy category to work through. And I share that because you might be feeling very overwhelmed by this category and therefore sort of reluctant to jump in. And I always like to validate that, believe me, you're not alone in feeling one way or the other. All right, so the reality is in tidying books, um, if you haven't read it yet, and this is something that Marie Kondo makes abundantly clear actually in The Life Changing Magic of Tidying Up, and I love it so, so much because it's so, so true. If you haven't read it yet, the chances are you aren't going to. Now, we all have great intentions, and when you bought the book or when the book was handed to you, you accepted it or you purchased it based on the fact that you had the intention of reading it. And sometimes when we don't follow through with that, guilt can come in. And often it's really hard to name that emotion or that struggle, but really it boils down to guilt. Guilt because you didn't follow through, you meant to do it, you wanted to do it. And then there's also a sense of disappointment, like, why didn't I do that? And that's what we really, really need to work toward curbing. We all live with, and this was something that was such an eye opener to me personally in going through the process, just the amount of guilt that I lived with for so long toward almost everything, truly. If I didn't read something, I felt badly because so and so had given it to me, or I spent $15 on the book, and that could have been $15 spent doing this, that, or the other thing. And we have to just give that up. We have to move past that because the reality is, and this is another Marie Kondo point, the money is spent, right? And the moment has passed. And the beautiful thing about truly the human experience is that you never stop learning and you never stop evolving and you never stop discovering things about yourself. So in the moment, and and I do this often, so bear with me, I just kind of share my own little personal stories or experiences. But for me, I had a lot of books on various topics. So, for example, I had quite a few books on attachment parenting. With our oldest, I really thought that that was something that I needed to read up on. I really wanted to be educated, to spend a lot of money on these books. And I would get them and I'd flip through them and then I'd be bored by them and they'd go up on a shelf. And so when I started tidying my books, I had to accept the fact that I had probably spent hundreds of dollars on this one particular topic. And so I had guilt toward the money spent. I had guilt toward the fact that I never followed through. So to some extent, I also felt like, well, I failed my child because I didn't spend time reading up on this information. And then I felt guilty because I was just reluctant to let them go. I couldn't figure out why. And when I really sort of explored that emotion, it really did come down to just feeling a sense of guilt, but also a sense of disappointment in myself. And then it kind of, I went down the rabbit hole with it. And again, as I mentioned, I kind of felt like, a bad parent. And I felt like, why did I get bored of this topic? Shouldn't it mean something to me? Anyway, it really kind of blew up. And then I kind of had to just have a little pep talk with myself, so to speak, to remind myself that, you know what, I could have sat down and I could have read that book. But instead, what I did is I sat down with my child on the floor and we played, or we went for a walk, or I read up on something that was actually of interest to me. And obviously, developing your own sense of self while also being a parent is very important as well. And so I had to learn to be more gentle with myself. And going through books was sort of my first experience of this, and it happened basically from that point of acknowledgement within the book category, and it carried through all the way through to the very end of the process. And it was such a deep, deep learning experience for me, a very big personal growth journey. And you all will come to recognize that in your own capacity and in ways that speak just specifically with you and your journey and who you are as a person. It's amazing how this process is truly 50% decluttering, but also 50% personal growth and development. It really, really is. So, kind of coming back, I felt like I went off a little bit there, but coming back to the first point here, if you haven't read it, accept that the reality is you won't, and to move on from that. Another thing that I came to appreciate is the idea of letting go of guilt, as I said, because things and interest change. We are not meant to stay the same. Our interests are not meant to stay the same. We are meant to grow and evolve and discover and experiment. And that is truly a beautiful gift. It's part of the human experience. And if you allow yourself to stay stagnant in feelings of guilt and disappointment, you are crippling yourself in being able to grow and develop and experiment and to be able to push yourself to be a better version of yourself. So, is that worth the $15 of holding up a book? Absolutely not. Another neat way to look at this is when you let go of certain things. So for me, letting go of that, basically a collection of attachment parenting books, and letting that go, I allowed new interests to come in. And it really is amazing. I can't describe it to you well enough, but it's something that if you do it, you will experience and you'll know what I'm referring to. When you let go of things that you were sort of holding on to or were being held back by, new things will find themselves to you. And it's a really, really neat thing to go through, to experience. All right, so when it comes to returning the books that you determine you want to keep, consider this your book hall of fame. This is another famous Marie Kondo expression or analogy, I guess, but you really want to make sure that what you decide to keep really are the best of the best. They're books that even if you never open them up again, they just spark joy for you to look at. Books can be beautiful tokens of interest, of times in our lives. I know that I don't have a lot of books, but I do have a couple. And there's ones that just the titles, just the books themselves, like the physical, tangible book makes me feel joy. And so do consider displaying your books in such a way that you receive that joy. This is something that we'll talk a lot about throughout the program, is really, what you're ultimately setting yourself up for within your home is, that you should be able to look around everywhere, no matter where you stand, no matter what room you're in, and feel joy, feel happy, feel contentment. You really want your home to be your sanctuary. And so if you have books that spark joy for you, and I'm sure you at least have a few by the time you're done your tidying, consider ways in which you can display them so that you can receive joy from them daily. So I just kind of I have a few photos here. I don't typically put photos in these webinars because I just really like to talk and keep it very simple without a lot of distraction. But I do like visual aids every once in a while. And so in particular, this second photo where you see the books stacked up and they almost serve a purpose, like a little side table there. I just think it's so neat because I can imagine walking into that room and seeing that grouping of books serving a purpose, and also being able to see the titles of the books along the spine. I think that that's such a neat way to display them. And I love in the first and second picture that the books are displayed in common areas of the home. Now, the first picture is a little bit conventional in terms of having the books on an actual bookshelf, but I still feel like they're in a really frequently used area of the home, and I just feel like the way that the sunlight would come in, they would light up. I can see that they would be very much appreciated in that room. And here in the third picture, I have a grouping of books here, and they're alongside of other little tokens, and I think that's a nice way to kind of complement things. Is you don't have to just put books where they are most assumed, like in a bookcase or on a shelf or in a closet or wherever. You can put them out and about. You can put them on a coffee table. You can put them on an end table. You can put them, really anywhere, on your dresser, on a side table, and put them among other things that spark joy for you. Okay, so changing gears a little bit here, specifically talking about how and when to tidy with kids. So, when it comes to really carving out your own path for your journey, this is really where you are in full control, and there's nobody else that can decide this for you but yourself, because we all have our own things to contend with, and I can't tell you what makes the most amount of sense for you because I don't know your day-to-day living, right? I don't know how you feel toward things. I don't know what is most reasonable and what most realistic for you. That's something that you need to come to the decision on yourself. So really what it comes down to is really two different approaches. So approach A is to work as a family from the beginning. This works for some families. I see it work most often for families of older children, in which they can really help, to which you can have ongoing conversations, in which children in particular aren't going to lose focus so quickly as younger children do. But I've also seen families of very small children be very successful with taking this approach as well. B is to first, so this is the second approach, is to first tidy yourself. So view yourself as the main facilitator. So do complete the process yourself and then circle back and bring in other members. There's also sort of like a C, I guess, approach of maybe marking out certain categories. So maybe with your children, you feel called to go through their clothing, but maybe you won't do books with them right away. And maybe you'll come back and do toys with them when you reach that category. So there are, I guess, three different approaches. And again, it really comes down to what sort of resonates best with you. Some food for thought, and this hopefully will help you to decide what's going to ultimately work best for you, is first to answer the question of how receptive is your family. So when you discussed first wanting to sign up the program with your partner, with your children, with yourself, how receptive do you feel your family is on the whole? So if your family is really only like 25% receptive, I will just come out and tell you right now, I would hold off in really pushing for them to be involved right now. You want people to be at least at the 50% mark of wanting or being curious about the process, because if they're really not feeling it, you pushing them to start right now is just going to backfire, to be quite honest with you. So at least if your children, your partner, whoever you share your home with, if they are at least 50% there interested, you can work with that. The other question is, how much time do you currently have to devote to tidying? If you feel like, you know what, it's a struggle right now just to get through my effects per category, then be realistic in recognizing it's probably not going to work for you to take on tidying other people's things at the same time necessarily. Maybe it will. Maybe you'll just say, you know what, I'm going to take a slower approach. I might be behind on the program timeline, but at least by the end of the process, I know that it's all done. The third question is, does tidying come natural to you? If you are struggling, if you find this challenging, then be fair to yourself and not adding unnecessary stress or pressure in trying to facilitate other people's journeys as well. You will get to a place, I can assure you of this, where you will feel comfortable, where you will feel natural. But if you're not feeling that right now, don't add unnecessary stress to yourself. So again, these are just things that I recommend sort of mulling over. You don't have to commit to anything permanently. You can try working as a family from the beginning, and if it doesn't come together, if you're not settling well into that, then change and go with, option B, or as I kind of said, option C, and see how that works. There's no really right or wrong approach. It's really what is most maintainable for you, because you really want to set yourself up for success. And when you add too much onto your plate, you will find that you'll start to kind of push back, and you're basically pushing back on yourself, but you'll find that your passion is compromised, and that's the last thing that we want to happen. So another topic that I wanted to share with you is the idea of maintaining a realistic tidying pace and how to do this. So first and foremost, I want you to recognize that this is your journey. And what I mean by that is you are ultimately the one that is going to set, oh, I skipped ahead. I do apologize. You're going to be the one that's going to establish your pace, what works for you. You're going to settle into what it means to tidy, whether you find that you like to tidy with music, whether you like to tidy on a Saturday, maybe you feel more motivated in the morning or the evening. You are going to settle in what works best for you, and you're going to carve out your journey. I always kind of describe this program as, I lay the path out before you in terms of the road, but you ultimately are behind the driver's seat, and you set the pace. You decide when you need a break, when you need to ease up or pick up the pace. You determine all of that. You also determine if you're going to pull off on the side of the road for a time or turn around and reverse and go home. But you will ultimately decide that. The other thing that I want to pass along is becoming familiar, and I kind of spoke about this a little bit, your tidying routine. I always say it takes until at least the second tidying category, if not the third, to really settle into what works best for you, and determining and really establishing what is optimal for you will allow you to maintain a realistic tidying pace. Putting too much pressure on yourself, setting yourself up for an unsuccessful tidying session because you chose to tidy, on a Wednesday evening. And Wednesday evenings, you had this, that, and the other thing going on, and it just wasn't really a great tidying time for you. That's where you have to take control, and you have to say, you know what? No, I'm going to schedule, I'm going to plan, I'm going to have, morning sessions or evening sessions, whatever work best for you, and commit yourself to that. But you really, in order to be able to do that, have to be familiar with ultimately what works best for you. I always suggest looking ahead at the next few categories to gain a sense of the time commitment, okay? Because I can say, this is a heavier category coming up, but for some people it's not. And some of the categories that I deem sort of lighter ones, for some people prove to be some of they're more heavier ones. So when you can look ahead at, the next at least two categories, you can plan, you can start to schedule according to that. So for example, maybe in two categories time, you're thinking, oh my gosh, um, paper, for example, that's going to take a lot for me. Start preparing in advance of that. Try and reduce as much as you can during that week. And so if you can take on things the week before in terms of obligations, appointments, things that you would like to get done, do those during your lighter weeks so that you can free yourself up for the weeks that require more time commitment. So again, basically what I was trying to say is consider the approximate tidying time against your own schedule and plan accordingly. Prepare in advance of tidying. There's different ways that you can do this, but basically, so for example, let's kind of go back to the first week. So say you finish clothing on Thursday. What I would recommend doing is to look ahead, obviously, and recognize, okay, I have books coming up, and start to maybe gather up all of your books so that come Sunday or whenever the tidying session is, your next tidying session is, you have everything gathered. So you're not wasting time, and you're making use of time as you have it. And that will free up time during that week of, say, tidying books. And then again, you can kind of jump ahead to the next category and get yourself prepared for paper. And you'll really come to appreciate this, especially because life happens and sometimes week to week things get added to our schedule that were unforeseen. And so if you can do a little bit of work ahead of time, it will save you for those weeks. It will really help you along during those weeks where, unpredictable things came up and you have to obviously prioritize and balance. So it can be very helpful to do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here. There weren't any questions that came in, and from what I can see, I don't know that anybody actually attended the slide presentation, which is no problem. There's a reason that I record them, and I know obviously I'm facilitating these during the day, and we're all very active parents, so it only stands to reason, and I never have a problem, obviously doing these webinars because I'll send along the recording just as soon as it's available to me. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this first webinar. If you do have any questions based on anything that I've shared or otherwise, please feel free to, I always encourage first and foremost, if you are participating in the Facebook component, please pose your questions if you're comfortable there first, just because others will receive the benefit of being able to see my response. Again, if you're thinking it, likely at least one other person in the program is as well. If you're not participating in the Facebook component and or it's something that you just don't feel comfortable sharing as a group, there's no problem with that. I always encourage emailing me as soon as possible. I always say my response time is about 24 hours. Usually it's a lot less than that. And if it goes beyond 48 hours, send me a little nudge, send me a follow-up email, retag me again in the Facebook group, because ultimately I don't want anybody having to wait longer than necessary to get their answers that you are seeking, because we want to keep momentum. We want to keep you moving. So that's it for webinar number 1. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next correspondence. Bye.